Well, here's a question to start our time together. Imagine a nonprofit leader saying something like this: we have a compelling mission, great outcomes, loyal donors, but our fundraising appeals are still underperforming. How would you respond to that? What kind of an answer would you give? Well, we're going to talk about this and other questions related today to this particular topic. And my name is Dr. Randy Dirks, and this is Funding the Future Now podcast. It's designed for people in the nonprofit world, but also broadens to other leadership areas. And we really want to give very practical daily guidance and help. So something you hear today on the topic of communication, you could say, I could apply that today. I could use that tomorrow in the things that we do. And today I'm just delighted to have a very special guest with us, Madeleine Nance. And Madeleine brings some unique experience with her. She helps nonprofit teams create fundraising communications, and that's an important part of what we do. But her desire is to move donors to the point that they say, I really want to give to what I'm hearing about. So she's using emotive writing strategies that she developed after spending more than a decade in the sector. And after working with more than 100 plus nonprofits around the globe, Madeleine has found what she says is the missing link, almost always the same in every nonprofit, and that's emotive connection. So Madeleine, so glad to have you here today. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
So you're welcome to call me Maddie if you like. I have been in the nonprofit sector it's coming up to 20 years now, almost my whole career. I
Okay.
started out interning, and then I worked for in-house for three different nonprofit organizations across the world before starting my own business. This was when I had my first baby and I became a mum and my priorities changed. And so I started my own business around that time, working specifically for nonprofits and writing their communications. So I've been in the sector for a long time, but in different ways, you could say. And I have a big love for the nonprofit sector and the people who choose to work in this.
Well, it is so important, this topic of communication and how do we use words all the time. I understand that, but it's the kinds of words we use and how we frame it that is so critical in our nonprofit world, because there are messages coming from us to us from all different angles. And so communication is so important. So here's a question. When a nonprofit president, let's imagine, hands you their fundraising appeal and says something isn't working, which is not good news, what's the one thing you almost always find that's missing? And why does it keep showing up even in well-run organizations?
So it's funny, I see the same trend almost every time when I'm reviewing someone's fundraising communications. And I think it comes from a place where we have this urge to tell people everything all at once. So
Hmm.
I've got to tell this person, I've got to talk about all the things my organization does,
Yeah.
every program, everything. And what that does is it actually creates noise. You become white noise. And so we need to reframe that. And what I see is a lot of communications are taking the approach of trying to educate donors. That's the number
Yes.
one priority, instead of connecting. And one thing I always want people to take a moment to understand is how we as humans make decisions. It's with our emotions. So it's actually not, we might like to think we're more rational than
Sure.
we are. And yes, we make rational decisions, but for many of us, at the end of the day, it's an emotional decision,
Mhm.
especially to give to a cause, to support a cause.
For sure.
So when you think about that, that should be the priority,
Yeah.
to connect emotionally with your supporter, not to educate them. That can come later, but you've got to have that emotional connection first. So that's almost always my feedback when I see some organizations fundraising communications, is that you are prioritizing educating over connecting.
Yeah, that's so well put. And, when we think of informing people, it's data, it's numbers, it's spreadsheets. Those have a place, as you indicated, but it's further along in the connection process. And so that story, that emotion, that one person that changed and transformed. I know you live with that all the time. I used to write my communications much more broadly. We did this, and notice where the first word was on we.
Hmm.
And now I'm realizing, oh no, that's not true. What you just said, tapping into the emotion, the story is so vital. That's great. Well, how about this? Most fundraising executives feel pressure to sound professional and data driven in donor communications. How does that instinct actually work against them when it comes to getting donors to give? So they're trying hard to sound professional, to do everything in the right way, but it actually is defeating their purpose. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I would say the best way to put this to help people understand this is to picture yourself in an actual conversation sitting in front of someone. So if you think about a time when you've been speaking to someone, or let's say you meet someone at a social event, you're meeting them for the first time. If they just started talking at you about themselves, like it didn't feel like a two-way conversation, they weren't interested in you,
Yeah.
usually it's not very nice having that kind of conversation. You kind of don't really want to continue it. You think, I don't really want to get to know this person either because they don't want to get to know me. And so when we take it down to a really relatable situation like that, it was like, how do you feel in a conversation with you're a human with another human? Apply that to your fundraising communications. So even if this is an email that you are sending to 10,000 donors, they have to feel like it's you speaking to them, that it's
Yeah.
a one-to-one conversation, that it has to have a sense of two-way communication. And you can do that. And you said it already, you hit the nail on the head, Randy, when you said, instead of saying a lot of we do this, we are so great, this is what we're doing, swap those for you.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
look what you've helped make happen. Look at what your support means to this person, the story you're telling. So just making those simple word swaps takes that feeling of just talking at you to we're talking together.
Yeah. I love that. And there's so much we have to get over ourselves as fundraising
Yep.
executives and put somebody else at the spotlight. And that's so well put. How about this question? If a nonprofit president came to you and said, we've got a mission that's really compelling and they really feel it, they know that. And we've got great outcomes, great donors, but our fundraising appeals are still underperforming. Where would you tell them to look first?
I'm in the business of communications and my focus is on the words, but I have to acknowledge the importance of data as well. So the importance of your actual list. So do you know your donors? Do you even need to segment your list
Oh, for
instead of
sure.
doing a blanket talking to everybody the same?
Yes.
Are there ways you can personalize? So I can write an incredibly powerful fundraising appeal, but you can make it even better by bringing what you know about the supporters we're talking to into that equation.
Right.
So, for example, when we work with the children's organization, do we know who in our donor base, who are parents? Who can we say, you know this feeling from your own experience as a
Mhm.
parent? You know the love for your children.
Yeah.
So that's an example of personalization that's really powerful. And that's something that if overlooked, you will see your results drop because it'll start to have a generic feel.
Oh, sure.
Coming back to what I was saying before, you want people to feel like you're talking to them
Mhm.
personally. It's a one-to-one conversation. So wherever you can personalize and get to know your data better, that's going to make the words stronger that you use when speaking to them. So that's one thing. And another thing I will say, if we just specifically at the actual words, the copy in fundraising. One thing that I see overlooked a lot is it's really simple and it's literally just your opening line. How do you start an email?
Right.
Or how do you start a social media post or a letter to your donors? The amount of times I see, because I'm on a lot of lists, the amount of times I see "Dear Madeline, I hope this finds you well." And it's just like, you've just wasted your first line on something really boring and
Yeah,
generic
really.
when you could have used that to bring me in and
Mm.
make me feel like, "Oh, I really wanna read this."
Yes.
And so think of it as that opening line, the job of it is to get somebody emotionally connected to this. You want them to lock in and wanna put down whatever they're doing, put down the phone if they're reading a letter, or if they're on their phone, just stop multitasking, doing all the things,
Right.
and actually be like, "I wanna hear what this person has to say."
Yes.
And it's amazing what a difference it makes when you just the way you start a communication.
That is so true. I want to talk a little bit about segmenting because I think you've hit on something really vital. If you're on the podcast version of this right now, I'm creating a triangle with my hand. So there's the top part of the triangle and then there's the base. And if you're seeing this visually on YouTube, you just saw what I did. But even if you just thought of three segmented groups in your donor pool, you have the people at the top that give most of the money. Usually that's 20, 15 to 20%, and they're giving 80% of the money. They have a certain way they like to be communicated to. Then there's that mid tier, we'll call them the mid tier donors, and they have a different way of understanding life and relating. And then you've got those entry donors. And so if you were to say, just like you said, Madeline, I'm going to segment these people and respond to or communicate something to them that makes sense to their world rather than just, yeah, I hope this letter finds you well. I mean, I've already deleted that email, by the way, with that first line. And then it also comes to something else, and maybe you could speak to this, and it may not be your sweet spot, but I just think of using handwritten note to a donor because of what they specifically did, and I draw that out in that communication. So I'm saying, because of your gift of X, last month we were able to. In other words, you're really personalizing it more, and there's other ways of doing that too. Any comments on that kind of personalization?
Absolutely. That is one of my favorite ways to make somebody feel good about their support. And it's one of those things, and I will say this, with social media and AI, everything's online, everything is automated, everything there's just the level, the volume, the
Yeah.
sheer volume of content out there right now is through the roof. So, one way you can actually stand out from that and make someone feel that human connection is to go back to the basics. And a handwritten note is a perfect example of that
Yeah.
because they can actually picture this a real person sat down and wrote this to me
Sure.
on this piece of paper with a pen. That's a really special thing in this digital age to do.
Yeah, so well put. Here's the next question. Fundraising teams often wear too many hats to think deeply about how they're communicating with donors. What's the real cost of that? And what's the fastest shift a team can make to start seeing better results?
So I touched on this a little bit just now. With everything being so online right now and a lot of AI generated content, I think the best thing you can do right now is not waste a piece of communication. Do
Mm.
not waste a communication. It's a bit like and I just came to mind as a parent that the saying, don't waste a command, like you want to ask your child to do something, get them to stop what they're doing, look you in the eyes, and then they understand rather than saying it 8 times and sounding like white noise and they're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
concentrating on what you're saying. And it's a little bit like that in the fundraising world as well, where don't waste an email or a social media post, a letter on something that's not going to personally connect with
Mhm.
that person.
Yes.
If you do, you're just contributing to noise and you are going to make people feel not only disengaged, if they receive something from you and it has not personally and emotionally engaged them, not only will they delete that email, they'll probably unsubscribe
For
from your
sure.
list
Right.
because we are so overwhelmed right now with content. We're busy, we're distracted, so it's just another thing. So by not investing in getting it right, it's actually worse to send something that's not emotionally engaging.
Yeah.
You're actually doing harm
Harm.
to the relationship.
That's well put. I think we're maybe some of us feel we need to be on all these channels and we need to be communicating so frequently. But if we were just to step back and say, what's our overall goal? And if we could do one or two well done communication pieces that really speak to the need, the opportunity, the donor's interests, how much further ahead would we be? So, so well put. Well,
It's
good morning.
amazing too how you can do that even shorter if you can use because another thing I say is our attention spans are so short.
Yeah.
So if you can learn to say something really emotionally compelling in fewer words, that is such a skill in this day and age.
So true. Our choice of words. And even
Mhm.
that subject line in the email so that it is engaging from the very beginning, thought provoking. That will be get people at least to open your email, which is first step. And then, like you said, that very first line will keep them reading, and much thought needs to be given there. Well, what I do at the end of the podcast, I have what I call my fast five, and these are just quick questions. And so here's the first one. It's what is a great piece of professional advice you've received?
So I always come back to this. Professionally and personally, I will say, is my church pastor back in Australia used to say, keep the big things big and the small things small. And as someone who I will confess, I am a overthinker. And sometimes I find myself having to stop and be like, all right, is this actually a big thing? Am I giving big thoughts to big things and small thoughts to small things? And I feel the reason I bring this up is because I know people in the nonprofit sector can relate because especially when I've worked in small organizations where you're doing 8 people's full-time jobs in your own, you have to prioritize because it's just you will go mad trying to do everything.
Yeah, I love that. The next question, what's a daily habit you cannot live without?
Okay, so similarly, because I've got a racing mind all the time, I have to slow down at the end of the night. And as an Australian, I like my tea, so
Okay.
I have to have my chamomile tea
Oh,
at the
yeah,
end of the night.
yeah,
If I don't, it's just one of my routine things. I can't sleep.
sure. Love it. Here's a question. If you could go back to your 20-year-old self or say something to that young lady when she was 20 years old, what bit of advice would you give?
When I was 20, I was working in an office environment with people who were quite a bit older than me. And I found I felt like I was constantly in a state of feeling intimidated. And if I could go back there, I would say, it's okay. There are people too. Everybody's got their stuff.
Yeah,
Calm down. Stop
calm
being
down.
so intimidated.
Yeah, drink your chamomile tea.
Yep.
Calm down.
Here you go.
All right, love it. Next question. I want you to think of something maybe you wish you would have changed. You could call it a failure or a regret. But instead of focusing on that, I'd like you to say, how did that experience actually set you up for later success?
Just thinking, coming off the last question, thinking about when I first started out in my career, I worked with some, obviously, I'm not going to name names, but I've worked with some quite difficult personalities.
Okay.
And what it taught me, even though at the time it felt like I'm failing, I'm not doing a good job, or I don't know, it was just not a nice situation.
Yes.
And it felt like failure. It felt like I don't want to do this. It made me question whether I wanted to go down this path. But what it taught me is it's like with a bad relationship, you learn what you don't want.
Oh,
So
sure.
it taught me what kind of manager I want to be based on how it felt to be managed this way. And so it actually did turn into a helpful learning for
Mhm.
later in life when I did move up over the years and found myself managing a large department of people. I had that still in my mind of, okay, I don't want anyone to feel like how I felt 10
Yeah,
years ago
for sure.
as a junior.
Right. So well put. The last question. Where's your favorite place on earth or maybe in your backyard to disconnect and recharge?
Okay, so this is a tricky question because I'm, as you can tell, I'm not from the US. I'm living in Charlotte, North Carolina now, but I've spent my life moving around. And so I've had to make a bit of a mindset shift that it's less about where I am and it's more about who I'm with.
Mm.
And so
Okay.
I made the personal choice that my home is with my husband and children, my family. And so where that is, that's okay, as long as I'm with them.
Yeah.
But I will say, because you just made me think of this, even in my own backyard, I love my backyard. And
Okay.
that was a big part of moving from Sydney to Charlotte is we have a house with a backyard, and I
Yeah,
so appreciate that after living in big cities.
for
So I
sure.
have grass I can walk around in and my kids can play.
Good.
I very much appreciate this.
Yeah, so good. Wonderful. Well, Madeline, you've been a delight. You brought some very practical, useful understandings in our world of communication. We use words all the time, and sometimes they can be powerful, energetic words, and sometimes they can be very lifeless words. And so, thank you for these insights. Why don't you just take some time now just sharing with people how they can connect with you?
Yeah, so I would say the best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. I'm a little bit obsessed with LinkedIn, so I'm on it all the time. So
Yeah.
feel free to send me a message. So it's my name, Madeline Nance, Nance, on LinkedIn. And I would love to hear from people or just chat that way. And then you've also got my website, which is kindwordreview.com.
Great, kind word review. I love that. Well, Madeline, thank you for joining us today, and just want to speak out to our listening audience. So, my name again is Dr. Randy Dirks, and this is Funding the Future Now podcast. We deliver these on your favorite podcast channels twice a week at least, and also on YouTube. And we just invite you back. We want this to be a practical life kind of giving opportunity, again, where you can take things that Madeline and others have shared and use them in your world right away. So for now, that's it, and we welcome you back next time.
Thank you, Randy.